Hello, everyone. My name is Caridad Svich, and this is Conversations from the Alcove, a series of conversations, mostly with playwrights and theater makers, looking at the craft of playwriting, but also art, life, and its engagement with the world. Today's guest is A.K. Payne. I'll do a brief bio for them, but before I do, I'm just going to do some audio descriptions for you. So I am a fair-skinned person with a sort of auburnish hair, sometimes depending on the day. Today, you would see my bangs that are fairly prominent, but my hair is pulled up. I usually have it down. I'm wearing a black shirt with a faux string of pearls around, sort of adorning my black shirt. I'm against a white background, vaguely white, grayish background. On the corner, you might see indication of a lamp of some kind. Way in the background. And I'm beaming in from the land of the Lenape that was stolen by colonials. I will now introduce AK, and hopefully AK will also describe themselves. AK Payne is a playwright, artist, theorist, and theater maker with roots in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Their plays love on and engage in interdependencies of Black past, present, and futures, and seek to find, remember language that might move us toward our collective liberations, plural. The work has been seen any number of places. It will be all over the world soon, yay. They just graduated, pretty much, almost, it feels like, formerly known Yale School of Drama, mentored by Terrell McCraney, and they just opened a show at the Alliance Theater called Furlough's Paradise at the time of this recording. I won't go on into all the many accolades to say they're just an amazing poet and playwright, and I'm a big fan. AK, anything you'd like to say about where you're beaming from, all that good stuff?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I am zooming in from New Rochelle, New York, so above New York City. I'm currently I'm wearing like a red ruby colored head wrap. I'm a brown skin Black person, and I have on a green strapless dress right now, and I have a plant in my background and some artwork on my walls, and I'm in my apartment here in New York.
Yay!
Here, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as Caridad mentioned, but I'm currently based in New York, so I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Yeah, super cool. Thanks for making time. I think that every question for this series starts with the same question because it feels like it's the question that we're living in, which is we're in an accelerated climate crisis, planetary emergency, and how is this reshaping your work as an artist and a thinker about not only how you make things but what you make?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about like the resources that we put into making things, and like how I'm really excited right now in like theater that can be done in like with like finite resources. So like, what does it mean to imagine something in a room that perhaps has nothing in it, and like the voices and the character stories is what carries us through. I think one of the most like human things that we do is gather around and tell stories, like around a fire, around a space. And I think that as we approach like climate catastrophe, it's going to become even more and more imperative to be able to gather and to be able to like really strip down to like what is the story that we're trying to tell, and writing plays that are really at their core about character and not relying on spectacle at the expense of character. I think is really important in how I think about making work, because I'm just really passionate about like that kind of baseline as a thing that like drives us. I think that's like one of the big things. And then also a lot of the stories I'm thinking about right now are about characters at the end of a lineage or the end of a world. I think that's like informed by climate change and climate catastrophe, and also by just the ways that like Black and brown lives are constantly under threat and attack, and the ways that like environmental racism attacks and comes for them first. And I'm very aware of that. And like even being from Pittsburgh, a place that environmental racism is so deep in the soil and the earth in relation to like the history of the mills and the ways that Black and brown people have lived near there and are still like feeling the effects of the industrial moment in that city. And all people are, but I think like it hits Black and brown communities first. And so a lot of my plays are thinking about characters who are managing to love each other and hold each other at the end of the world. So yeah.
Yeah, how do we hold each other at the end of the world when the world is not allowing us to hold each other on so many levels? I think a lot about. I was just talking to a colleague, actually another playwright yesterday, not for this series, although maybe one day. But we were talking about the difficulty around being in theater spaces. So let's say physical buildings or stuff that make the act of holding, if not difficult or impossible, for access reasons, for all kinds of barrier reasons, that make our work then more hard to do. Do you know what I mean? And I think this is slightly related, tangentially related, potentially, to this question of the fact that theater industry, which is different from theater as a form, is a polluter, right? We run on, I keep saying to people, rethink everything. You can't do it the same old. It's not going to work. I don't care how many times you say you're going to run a tour and do it, but how many trucks are in that tour? How many planes are you using? All these things that have become, attached to a neoliberal way of working that the industry has been joined at the hip at for quite some time. So I think a little bit about how do you create those spaces of love and holding inside spaces that aren't about that. So this is like a follow-up question, but I wonder if you have, I'm not saying you have like all the wisdom from the heavens, but I'm saying that I wonder if you have strategies around that as a maker.
Yeah, absolutely. I started, I think, writing or creating theatrical spaces from that exact place of being one of the only like theater makers in my undergrad program and feeling like I wanted to create alternative worlds where like Black students could gather and could just feel like their voices, like they could speak the way they needed to, that they could like just be. And I started like directing when I was an undergrad with like our little Black theater ensemble that we had of like just gathering and just trying to figure out how to create hubs and oases for one another. So it was always counter to the culture of our school that often felt very much like there was a system that mirrored the world in many ways in which we were not able to just exist and be. And so I think about that a lot and about like how in many ways, I think, and Augusto Boal said this, of like theater being a rehearsal for revolution, and that being like how I think about the rehearsal room too, that there is kind of like, what does it mean for us to lay down the blueprints of like what kind of world we hope to exist in, whether that's on the page in the text, which I think is like, for me, like one of the first ways that I can create an invitation for that kind of thinking. But then also in like how we build in a really ethical and like intentional way the conditions of the rehearsal room. What agreements do we make? How do we see one another? How do we create conditions of care? Do we have yoga mats in the space? Do we have food for people? Like what are the ways that like we are showing what world is possible when we're rehearsing a play, so that when we bring it to an audience, we're extending that world and creating ripples and creating new ideological formations or new ways of thinking about how we exist in the world and I can exist in the world. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but my hope is there's change through the rehearsal, the revolution, the play of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I find that sometimes the obstacles are not in the rehearsal room if all the care is being taken, but actually once you let's say you're working in a venue, once you're like installing it in a venue and dealing with the apparatus of the venue itself, right? The machinery of access to tickets, who can afford them, why why are people being like, what is the economic barrier, but also what are the physical barriers that are placed on people, sort of the ableism that is part of our industry that is very, very strong, sadly. And also like how the space is configured physically, that sometimes makes that the gesture that the piece is trying to make, the art piece is trying to make, jump through more hurdles, in other words, in order to be received and have, I think I sometimes talk about with students, especially about what is the act of openness that theater requires from performers and makers, but also from the audience, right? The audience, you have to get to a space of openness to be able to receive, to be able to be witness, to be able to be participant. And you're coming in already with the world and everything, right? That's happening, and they're already kind of all these guards up, you know what I mean? So that getting to a place of openness is so crucial, and it takes like time to do that. And every step of entering that space, if it's a physical space, but even if it's an outdoor space, however it's configured, is conducive to that path of openness, right? Is kind of allowing that process. It's the play before the play in a way. And I feel that sometimes it's like, no, it starts when you walk into the thing. And I'm like, no, it actually starts like outside the building when you're trying to get there, and then in the lobby, and then in the, like, because if the lobby, I won't say the name of these places, but there's some venues where you walk into the lobby and it's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm being surveilled, monitored, treated with suspicion, like, all those things when you walk into a lobby, and then pushed around, like, and all this stuff. And then you're like, and then you walk into the space and you're supposed to be all open and giving and loving. I was like, no, I just went through like, a ton of surveillance before I walked in, so I think that in a way it makes our job harder. Because we're having to combat structures that sometimes we're not in control of when we make our work, right? No wild answers around this, but it's related to this question that I ask somewhat cheekily, but also quite profoundly, which is why theater then? Why do this? Why are we doing this? AK, tell me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think that it goes back to what I was saying earlier, of like one of the earliest things and ways that we created community and created culture was through gathering around a fire and telling a story, right? And that being like an early way that I think theater is, even sometimes when it pretends not to be, is in the lineage of that like really simple gathering space. And I do think that it in many ways harkens back to just the power of our breath, the capacity to change things, and reminds us that everything is an idea or is invented at some point. Like every system, every structure was from people sitting around at some point in time, sharing breath together and making a choice whether to create cultures of harm or to create cultures of abundance, of beauty, of love. And I'm really curious about like if we create alternative spaces to gather, like what are we breathing into? What is our collective power as like beings on this planet to transform things? And so I think that's why I think about theater and why I make theater. It's always about what it means to gather in a room and share breath, and to know that we in the present moment are capable of changing something, of noticing something, of making a new decision in a system that often like posits that we are powerless, or that we are not able to change systems that are like old or that have been passed down or that are rooted in all the many systems of white supremacy and colonialism and racism that exist in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I wonder if you would share with our viewers, or those who just maybe want to be listening when this airs, about what, like, maybe take an example of a recent rehearsal process that you've gone through, maybe Furlough's Paradise or Imani, which was a little while ago, but is still relevant, about how that rehearsal room is run and how you work with your collaborators.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about rehearsal rooms that have a collaborative leadership model, and working with directors and collaborators who are really about like trying to think about how we all have a different lens or role in how we're creating a story, that it's not ever like a kind of top-down thing. Like even for myself as a playwright, I come into the room with more questions than answers always. And I think about like the way that I work as a writer is often through listening, as opposed to like what I know about the characters is like what is on the page, because that's what I'm listening for. And there's things that I'm figuring out in real time, but I learned from the actors who are experiencing the world through their bodies, which is like such a new vault of information that like I experience sometimes when I'm like in my apartment reading the parts by myself, but I think like the actors are like really fully stepping into it and feeling the character like through their entire self. And so that opens up things for me to learn too. And then the director is like adding a vision to that. And so we're all collectively learning, I think, in the most ideal processes and the ones that have been most fruitful for my work, that we are all building worlds together and from our respective skill sets and spaces. And there's a lot of laughter in rooms that I love. There's a lot of like music. With Amani, we had an incredible stage manager named Kiana Brown, who like just had incredible playlists every break. We were like dancing and like adding. We had like affirmations on the walls during breaks, and we would put them up. And we had just like a lot of fun and laughter. And in the midst of stories that are not always easy to tell, I think it's really critical to create conditions where we can play and relish in being alive. And all of my plays really center Black life. And so what it means to be able to relish in being alive in systems that often don't want to see us living or thriving is really important for me, and speaks to like the practice of my work, even when it's traversive content that may be heavy or may be hard to tell at times. But I always think about how in the writing of it too, the characters get to breathe or exhale.
Right. Yeah. Got it. Understood. Yes. Okay. Games playing. This thing of like on breaks, there's music and there's like what? usually, oh my God, I just know so many spaces where the break is like, it feels like a sterile
Yeah.
environment, or everybody's running and they're like worried or whatever. So that's kind of lovely to hear that music gets piped in and like there's a kind of chill vibe, and that's awesome. Yeah, I hope I'm not saying this out of turn, is that I think of you as a poet first, a poet playwright, poet/playwright, playwright/poet, all those things combined. I also think that poetry and playwriting run on the same continuum, that they're both connected to the oral tradition. When I talk to people about theater, I'm always saying, we do this strange thing that's sort of orature, and it's performance literature, but it's not purely literary. Do you know what I mean? In that sense, that it kind of occupies this other space, and often it gets taught often as a literary genre only, right? Divorced from the oral tradition. So I guess that's why I'm always thinking about how poetry and playwriting are connected, sometimes quite literally, but often that they're coming from a similar root. And going about it in different ways sometimes. But also there's a fabulous, wonderful quote that I know has been overused, but I will say it again, which Lorca said many, many years ago, which is, a play is a poem standing up. And that's something I always carry with me as a playwright. And I feel like it's something to just keep reminding yourself, right? That it is a poem standing up. And it can be other things. It can be an essay. It can be other things. But basically, that's what it is. And so I wanted to see how you approach rhythm, meter, cadence, the concrete nature of the poetic in your work and in your craft as a writer.
Thank you for that question and for this quote. I love it so much. I've never heard that before, but I think it's great. Yeah, I've been thinking about poetry so often because I think I'm like reclaiming it for myself now, like because I think that I think of myself in like the lineage of like poets who are thinking about the body in relation to poetry. And I love what you were saying about like the continuum they live on together. I think that that's like really true, that it is something that like poetry for me, when it lives in the body, is where I think about it in plays, that like people are speaking in poetry because their bodies don't like are fighting against the limits of quotidian language and are trying to imagine other ways to speak. And my relationship with English is always really fraught because this is quote by Izaki Shange where she says, like, I've always wanted to attack and deform the language I was taught to hate myself in. And I find it really resonant for me because English is not something that it's what I've always spoken, it's what my people have always spoken in this country, but like it's not something that necessarily it feels something that really we like try to find our place in and find our cadence in and find what feels true for us in, because it's not something that like necessarily was inherently ours, and so like crafting it to make it ours. And yeah, I think about poetry in that way, as the way that we speak when language fails us, the way that we speak when we're trying to get to the thing that feels scary or big, and that we have to like push our words to get there. So there are poets that I'm like thinking about more and more as like the lineage that I'm part of. Like my fellow cohort member Rudy Goblin is a poet
Nice.
from grad school, and like I think about the way that he writes poetry and like invokes that with rhythm and with the body. And throughout Alvin training, his work is always invested in a poetic lens. But I had a relationship with poetry for a while, like being an English major at an Ivy League at a PWI, where it felt like it was from the brain and not the body. And that to me feels like a poetry that is a bit divorced from how I think about poetry as like something that like is really visceral from the stomach. Um, and yeah, in my work, I mean, my mom is a music teacher, and so I think a lot about rhythm when I'm writing. Like since I was a kid when I write, I like hum how words sound. Like I hum how they come into being as a way to think about like the flow of a play. Um, and I think that comes from her and like all the songs she made up when I was a kid, and like just being in her choirs growing up. Um, and yeah, so I think a lot about like poetry through music, and poetry through like how we fight against language and fight with language, and how it can attempt to hold what we feel, but the body is actually the thing that is the agent of that.
Sure. Yeah, amazing. Rudy Goblin is an artist that we've commissioned here at the Lortel. So very much a fan of his poetic, funny, passionate, fearless work, among other people that we love. I wanted to stay in this vein for a little bit, AK, which is to say that, you know, playwriting is a weird thing to choose to do for one's like, life, vocation, career, however, whatever words you want to use for it, calling, etc. And so let's take us back to like AK as a baby playwright. Like what were those first stirrings, and like what made you go like theater, yes, and this is how I want to make it. Do you know what I mean? Like, how would you put your stamp on claiming this space of theater for yourself? And but what did that look like when you were like, I don't know, doing your scribblings in the dark?
Yeah, I mean, I still feel like I'm in that place. I feel like I'm still up there. I mean, I think the first play I wrote, I was like 12 years old in Pittsburgh, and City Theater Company, which like is like a theatrical home for me now, is and has been since I was 12. They have like a Young Playwrights Festival where they like produce a few plays from middle schoolers and high schoolers. And I went to an arts high school called Kappa that my mom went to and that Billy Porter went to years and years ago. That was really special to me. And we wrote our plays, and I got to see this play come to life when I was 12. And I was sitting in the rehearsal room, and I was like, I want to do this forever. Like, it was so cool to be able to see like the world's like something that I had thought about like in quiet, like in my home, right? Like creating these ripples, but also like in conversation with like other folks, and like just sort of the community aspect of it, and the worlds that we were all adding to the structure of this story. And it was about this girl who was like, she was growing up in the civil rights movement, and she wanted to be a lawyer, and her dad was like, "You're a girl," and that was the structure of the play. But yeah, so it was I think a lot about, just community being at the heart of my work, the capacity to collaborate across different mediums. I was so in awe of like what the lighting designer was adding, what the costume designer was adding to tell a story. It's not something that I'm doing in isolation, but like really inherently depends on the collaboration. That's one of my favorite playwrights, Fornez. She talks about, the way that her work, I think, in my mind resonates is about you have to be in, like to see it in order to like really fully understand. And it's like the writing is telling part of the story, but the characters and the production and like the embodied nature of it is like telling so much more of the story. So I'm really excited by that in my practice. And then, as I mentioned, uh, I think the way I create theater has really been informed by the spaces that I've been both it's been difficult to exist in, and then also the ones that have been nourishing to exist in. So, um, as I was mentioning, like being in school and like needing to create alternative rooms for people to create in, we felt like we could be ourselves, but then also being in grad school under Terrell, who was like so deeply intentional about creating with conditions of like wellness at the helm, and then also with conditions of like care and support and like, you know, how do we put the person first as opposed to the product that we're creating? How do we gather with like our humanity at the helm, as opposed to like this thing that we're putting into the world, which I think is important. But if we are not taking care of the humans behind it, like what is the purpose? What kind of world we're trying to create? So the collaborators that I've loved working with and that I've grown up with, I think, have been the people who have oriented themselves towards that kind of theater.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just curious about, so City Theater in Pittsburgh, there are others, of course, Pittsburgh Public. Am I remembering that correctly? Pittsburgh Public, is that the name of it? Pittsburgh Public Theater?
Yeah, there's a theater in Pittsburgh. Like I've worked in Pittsburgh with City Theater with Pittsburgh Playwrights,
Okay.
which is like a theater like just who's done like all August Wilson's plays and
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wonder about, because sometimes, people come at theater in different ways, and also seeing it is different from reading it. Like I remember when I started writing or thinking about plays, which wasn't what I was thinking about. It wasn't what I was thinking of. This all happened because a teacher of mine in junior high suggested I try writing plays, and that's how I kind of fell into this and discovered that I really loved it. But there wasn't. I was living in Miami at the time, and there was no like real, there was no theater. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I could just walk down the street, go, hey, there's a play happening, and blah blah blah. So all my early contact with theater was either through recordings, like actual radio drama and recordings of plays, and also reading them and trying to figure out like how different writers, at least not knowing the other people that are involved and designers and so forth, how writers kind of approach the page and how they think about the elements of theater, the many elements of theater, and wondering like historically how the form has had many developments, right, over time. But I remember being daunted. You talk about the experience of seeing the play up on its feet at 12 years old and all that stuff. So I'm thinking about like seeing, I think it wasn't my first play that was done. No, actually, well, it's not true. I staged something in high school, but I don't count it. Like I feel like that was just a high school thing that I did. But there was this moment where I won a contest. I saw a play, it happened. I went to see it. They flew me out, all those things. And I did have that feeling suddenly, because at the time I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. What is this playwriting thing? Oh my gosh, my parents are working class. Like, what do they think? This is not a career path. Like, what am I doing? And so go to see the play, and then there was this feeling of, oh, it's so nice to see other people playing in the structure that I created. But actually I have no idea what they're going, like I wasn't part of that rehearsal. Literally I was flown in and kind of showed up, and it was so cool to see like, oh, these amazing minds, like these creative people just had these ideas about how to interpret what I lay down. Right. And so I think about that a lot, in relationship to when we work with collaborators, what gets laid down into the space? What is the process around that? And I wonder if you could speak to your work with designers a little bit more, and maybe looking at one of your specific rehearsal processes about how that's developed and blossomed over time.
Yeah. I think that, and specifically related to like designer processes, like how we communicate and collaborate in a process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in my favorite processes, it's always been, and I remember, I mean, I could probably describe this best through like a distinct memory or moment. But during Amani, for example, there was a point where we were trying to figure out, we had so many elements because we were like just so excited about the we had a band, we had so many different things in the production, and we had a moment where we like really just we were trying to make sure that we were still holding on to this character's journey, because Amani is the kind of anchor of that play. We're watching her move through life. And so we all gathered in a huddle, and it was like all the designers, and it was the director, Josiah Davis, who's one of my favorite collaborators in the world. And all just like gathered, and we're just brainstorming. And it was deeply collaborative. It was like it wasn't a sort of precious thing of like we're all staying in our lanes, but it was truly like we're all playing here. We're all trying to tell the story of this Black girl who is like trying to imagine a future for herself and for her communities. And so that was like a moment when I felt like that's like the kind of way that I want to create work. Is it's we all have our our expertise. I'm engaging in playwriting. I've worked in that way, but I think so often Western theater puts us in these silos or boxes of like that's our only way of engaging the world. And there's so much wisdom that we actually have that is either from just our experiences that I think informs how we create. And so for all of us to gather and be theater makers and to just try to figure out how to make this world align with Amani's dreams was like just such a beautiful moment of like thinking across like the different places that we exist, or like the work that we do or the job that we have, if that makes sense. And it was a lot of fun. And I think I've loved moments and processes where I discover something from a design choice. There's a moment in Amani, for example, where I was struggling to figure out where this monologue went for Smith. It always felt really weird. It's a monologue. He's leaving a voicemail for his daughter before he passes away, and I never knew where it went in the story. And then I was sitting in the rehearsal room. It was like the days of tech before we went into previews, and in the theater, in the theater, and the musicians were doing and the sound designer working on like a music sequence that felt like it was in this place where the monologue I think needed to be. And so I realized it by watching the actor who was like moving around the stage, running his lines, just like doing like his laps. And I was like, oh my gosh, the monologue goes there. And it was because of everybody's, different places in the room at that time. Everybody was like doing their individual work, but it taught me something about the plays.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you work closely with sound designers on your work, because your work is so sonically rich already? Do you know what I mean? So does that become something that starts early in the rehearsal process for you, or midway through?
That's something that I haven't thought that much about it, but I do think that like my favorite collaborations have been with sound designers. Some of them just because there's been sound really informs how I think about worlds of plays. Like, what do we hear in the room? What is the music people are listening to during that time? How do we move between scenes? How is that part of the storytelling? So, for example, for Furlough's Paradise, we start the show in this rendition with a stunning song that just like it just like sets the play into motion. And Tinashe, our director, like thought about that song like from the very beginning of the process, and it was in her mind. And I'm like so grateful for collaborators who are thinking like that. And one of my close friends, she graduated with me too, but Evdoxia Rego, she's a sound designer who just like creates such stunning worlds through the way that she thinks about sound. And we've like collaborated a lot and have thought about just the how sound informs how we think about the total landscape of the world, that it is something that is informed by both the words and the rhythms they make and the things they evoke, but then also the undertones of the thing.
Yeah. Have you ever started a play from from pure sound without spoken language?
Oh, that's a great question. I definitely started scenes from that way. But most of the things I've engaged have been songs with lyrics. But Amani began in many ways with Afro Blue by Abby Lincoln, that
Yeah.
cadence of song. And the lyrics of that too, but the rhythm is so, I mean, classic jazz standard, like
Right.
it's so recognizable. And yeah, I think I am informed. I haven't thought about this that much clearly, but I think I am informed by the ways, by different music compositions and different like sounds to begin processes in many ways. Yeah, but it sometimes isn't a roundabout way. I'll hear a song and then I'll come back to it and I'll realize that it has informed the journey. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. No, I wondered if sometimes it was a guiding principle. Like I wrote a play some years ago where I just decided that the whole play, even though it's not in the play, but that the play would be informed by drumming patterns.
Yes.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And so, but like, there's nothing in the play itself that says drumming or like, you know what I mean? It's just kind of like I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we started there? And then what do I build upon on top of that? Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
And like I mentioned, like I sort of hum when I'm writing, but then I also like sometimes will snap out the rhythm of what I'm writing, just like the kind of cadence. And with Love I Way Too Further is a play that I did for my second year show for grad school, and we actually used a metronome in the rehearsal room and in the production as well. And it was kind of hinting at the way that these characters are fighting against time. They're fighting against a structure of time that is falling on them, but also I used it throughout my entire writing process. I was listening to the metronome and writing these monologues in time or against time. It was like, how are the characters dancing around this like steady beat? And that was like really, really present in how I thought about it. And then I think a lot about like one of my first writing teachers. We weren't allowed in her class to listen to music while we were writing, and we were all so mad about it. This was in high school. We were like, we want to listen to music, but it started me like thinking about like, because sometimes when you're listening to music, it informs what you are writing. Like it will like cloud the rhythm of the play. And so ever since then I've written with like earplugs so that I can just like, I'm hearing silence or illusion of silence, because it actually helps me listen first to the rhythm the characters are creating before adding onto it.
So so is character your lead? Do you start with character then?
Yeah, I start with character.
Okay.
It's always like a line that comes up for me, which I really love. And I know you like edited the series of exercises from Fornes, but the way that it's about creating, I use those exercises so often, like creating character from the body, or creating character from like a single line or starting in that way. One of my teachers from undergrad, Deb Margolin.
Yes.
Well, yeah, she's the best. We would have us do these things called fill in the blanks, which we would start with a line and then just like keep writing other lines and just like go in loops. And it was so cool. So yeah, she's one of my big inspirations too.
Oh, super cool. Yeah. It's funny because I think that, no, I'll just say, working with Fornes for real, certainly thinking about character first, although the thing about Fornes is that there was also a great emphasis on place, location for character, and sometimes maybe location first. To be honest, it's sort of like, where is it?
Yeah.
Like, what does that feel like, and what is it? What is the ground of that? And really investigating the terrain in a very tactile way before actually character emerges. And I think that's true of a lot of her work as a playwright. But sometimes gets, shall I say, misunderstood or misread, because sometimes people look at Fornes's work and go with theme and like the subject matter, but actually it's the ground upon which it's built, and what is the quality of that ground, and what are its material elements that are active in the storytelling, because sometimes she denies elements in the storytelling. She goes, this one will not have sun, for example. You know what I mean? We will be in the darkness with this, or we'll be in kind of like an interior light that will refuse kind of like escape or whatever. So I think that there's something around thinking about the land central to Fornes. And it's something I feel when I read your work, AK, that there's a kind of rich landscape that's being evoked on the page itself. Like the page is sort of evoking something from me as a reader. And I, so not to get all geeky about it, but like how has it changed for you to approach the page, thinking about the format of the play, thinking about, like, it's one of the powers that we have as playwrights still, unless something changes in the world, to actually affect how the play is formatted.
Absolutely. Also, just, yeah, thank you for that offering around space and her work. That feels so true and makes so much sense. I love Faithful and Her Friends, of course, and like it's actually the only one I've actually gotten to see, but the way that it moves through space is like so fascinating to me, and that makes so much sense that that's like the backbone of how she writes. But what your last question? Sorry, it was
about the formatting of the text and how you feel. It's both an invitation to a reader, a future collaborator, a reader that may not know you, that suddenly encounters the play blind and goes like, I don't know who wrote this, boom. So like, what is that invitation for you, and how is it changing, or an evolution as well, because it doesn't mean there's one set way of doing it.
No, I found like the actual like structure on the page that I write in grad school, very much so when I was thinking about because and this is always something that I am trying to name in rehearsal rooms, but because of how I think about rhythm and cadence, I often write with these like line breaks that are, in an ideal world, a map to the breath, or a map to how an artist might find an invitation to like to like where the thoughts are going and how the brain is moving from thought to thought. But at the same time, like, I'm really passionate about like artists finding that through the body, so that's really an invitation as opposed to something that is like a Bible or like something that like you are sticking to very vehemently. I'm really curious about how actors can engage a line break or engage an invitation to breath, but also sort of think about where that invitation lives in their own body and in their own experience of a character, if that makes sense. And so my way I think about the page is often like, how do I create opportunities for breath, and also create a map in which an actor can explore a thought or a series of thoughts, like towards the heart of a play or the metaphor of a play. So yeah.
True. Yeah, I was thinking about what's his name? Wonderful poet, playwright, media artist, John Jesserin, who talks about, he's not the only one who says this, but he comes to mind readily around that a play for him, even his plays, which for some people are like weird and like disjointed and like another thing, but like for him, it's about, there's like a thought that sort of begins the play, and you're just carrying it through, and maybe there's a detour, and maybe there's a thing, but basically you're carrying that one thought through the entire show. And he always has this, I'll relate this slight anecdote, which is that, because I think about it often, and it relates to also the idea of working in a climate crisis. And when he started out making theater, he was doing it in like rock and roll clubs, and downtown New York in the 70s, that sort of romanticized period. It wasn't very romantic, but it was rock and roll, right? It was sort of like low cost, which is in New York is now not a thing anymore, right? So different kind of access for artists. But he said, we'd be in the club, and he had like one slot a night, so it was usually like the downtime when everybody went to the bar or something. So they're like, you have an hour to do a show while we've got drinks. That's your time to do your show. It's like, okay. And so he still does a lot of work with mediation and kind of screens and projection and like stuff like that. And there was one night where the electricity went out, and And so, suddenly all the screens and the projections are not there, right? But the actors were still on stage. And so he just whispered to them, he said, just keep going. Just say the text, just keep going. It's okay. Because I think the actors freaked out. They were like, no, but we're relying on the tech, and like, what's going to happen? And he's like, no, I know I'm like media person and I'm a visual artist and blah, 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 but it's really important to me. Don't worry. Like, it should hold up no matter what. If the lights go off, I don't know, bring out a candle, do whatever you need to do, but keep going. And so I think about that in terms of like that the text is also holding. It's actually literally holding the space. And that also it can kind of be what we're left with when everything falls apart, when everything is kind of like, you don't have all the toys, right? You don't have all the toys of making the experience happen. And the way that the text can occupy the space that is almost, shall we say, ceremonial or ritualistic, right? That can be like, if you just hold this line and you say the next one and I say the next one, we're kind of saving each other in this moment, right? So I think there's something sacred and beautiful about that, and I wonder if that resonates in any way.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Like the ways that theater can, like the words can be a sort of a thing that catches us or can save us in a process. I think like just sort of something that we can anchor onto and how we're creating relationship and building that the story, I think is really important to me too. Yeah.
Yeah, little things. Well, we'll leave it at that. I don't want to take up oodles of your time. You're a very busy person. What will happen next is that, hopefully our viewers will keep following the series. What I'm going to do right at this very moment is, after we hit stop recording, I will stay with AK just for a little bit online to say some final words with each other in private. But for those of you watching Conversations from the Alcove, thanks for staying with the series. Watch at any time. Follow us at the Lortel. We are doing new work. We are developing new work. Baby steps. It's happening. And so just keep an eye on our playwrights and the people that we're working with and we're supporting, and trying to lift up the off-Broadway community, especially at a time when things are so difficult in the world. So that's all for now in Conversation with the Alcove. Like I said, I'll stay online with AK for just a little bit after this, and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Yay.